Welcome back, Blender Heads. I'm Jamie Dunbar. I'm from Dragon Boot Studios. This is a Gremlin, and this is video 2. So if you haven't already, go back and watch video 1, then come back here. In the previous video, we did a base sculpt of our Gremlin character and retopologized him. So to start off this video, we're going to reproject our high poly sculpted details back onto our retopologized mesh. Now, I am planning on doing a detailed step-by-step tutorial of this process, so if this is a little hard to follow, don't worry, there'll be a detailed breakdown coming soon. But the short version is, add a multi-res modifier to your retopologized mesh, and add a couple of subdivision levels. Add a shrink wrap modifier, and set the target to be your high poly sculpt. My preferred settings for the shrink wrap is project for the wrap method, above surface for the snap mode, positive and negative must both be checked, and add just a small amount of offset. You might also notice during this video that there's a few vertices that sort of spin out and jump halfway across the screen. These are just some rogue vertices that aren't being projected properly. The fastest way to clean these up is to add a low number into the limit field. This limits how far the shrink wrap can move your vertices and helps keep them relatively close to the original position. At this point, you can add some extra subdivisions to your multi-res modifier until you're happy it's picking up all the details from your high poly sculpt. Once you think you've got all the details shrink wrapped, you can apply the shrink wrap modifier. This bakes all of that detail into your multi-res modifier. I think a lot of people get concerned when their reprojection detail isn't perfect. They think they've done something wrong. But there's almost always a little bit of cleanup required after a reprojection like this. The most common areas are places where there's some kind of hole or socket, so eye sockets or nostrils, mouth interiors, even the corners of the lips. In the case of our Gremlin here, the armour plates on his shoulders, and possibly where the fingertips join the claws can be problem areas. The other thing to remember during this cleanup process is that each level of subdivision may need fixing. That's because the detail gets baked at each level, so some of these defects may exist on subdivision level 1, some may be on subdivision level 5. I'd recommend starting with the lowest subdivision level as it has the largest area of influence and working your way up the levels, smoothing out these little defects as you go. Now that I'm ready to start adding the finer details, I switch from predominantly using the clay brush to the clay strips brush and give it a soft fall off. This helps add a little bit of texture to my brush strokes and helps make the surface look just a little bit more like skin. Adding skin detail is really important. When beginners are first learning their anatomy, they have a tendency to carve in really deep muscle shapes. Now, unless you're a full-time bodybuilder, it's extremely rare to have muscles that are so well defined. There's almost always a small amount of fat, or at the very least skin, on top of all of those muscle details that kind of softens their appearance. At this point I'm sitting up around 5 million polys, which is quite a lot of detail, but I'm going to need all of it as I start adding these little scales in around the armour plates and for the skin alpha textures later on. A big part of this process is just simply going over the whole model again, sharpening up edges and adding bulk and texture where needed, especially on the scaly or leathery parts. After this detailing pass, it's time to start getting into the high level details like wrinkles, scales and skin textures. The wrinkles on the finger joints have a very particular shape. There's a line at the top and the bottom that goes around the joint. These are very well defined, and if you watch your own fingers curl, you can see why. The skin folds and bulges in almost exactly the same way every time. There are also some smaller, less defined wrinkles, as this folding isn't always exactly the same every time. I spend a bit of time detailing the face. This is a combination of adding wrinkles and adding a little bit of extra volume and skin texture. Now with the wrinkles, I'm always considering how the skin would deform if he was speaking or snarling. Wrinkles form because the skin moves in a particular way over and over and over again. So analysing how a face would move tells you how these wrinkles should form. While we're watching the face sculpting here, I just wanted to give a shout out to everybody who's subscribed to the channel so far. Only a few months ago this channel hit 1,000 subscribers for the first time and we're already closing in on 2,000. Now that said, I have looked at the channel statistics and there's a whopping 80% of you guys that aren't subscribed. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to see more of it, and you'd like me to know that you want to see more of it, the best thing you can do right now is subscribe. Watching the subscriber count go up as fast as it has been extremely inspiring, and it gets me pumped to make even more stuff. The reference I was using had these bony ridges here, kind of like the armour plates on the rest of the Gremlin's body. I experimented with doing the same, but ultimately I don't like these kind of hard surfaces with straight lines near the eye. Later you'll see that I erase these lines and instead use some softer wrinkles. This level of detail requires another subdivision level, which takes me up to 26 million polys. Now that's a crazy amount of detail, which is beginning to rival even ZBrush. You'll see the level of detail I get from this many polys, and unless you're doing some crazy close-ups for big screens, there's not going to be a lot of instances where you need much more detail than this. Now once I get to this 26 million polys, I did notice a bug where Blender starts to lag heaps, like pretty much an unusable kind of lag. But I found simply zooming out until my entire model was in view, then zooming back in completely removed the lag. I'm sure this has something to do with your model needing to be loaded into RAM and zooming out forces Blender to update. This seems like something that will probably be fixed in future versions, but until then, if you find that your scene suddenly becomes really laggy, just try zooming out and zooming back in. A lot of the details that I'm adding at this point are very fine, and they would take an extremely long time to do by hand. To help speed things up, I start using alphas on my brush to give me a starting point. I usually set these alphas up on my standard brush as I don't use it much, and these default settings work really well for placing alphas. So you can see here I add some alpha wrinkles to the eyes, but then I come back and hand paint over the area to emphasize the flow of the wrinkles. Alphas are really great, but try and use them as a starting point and not as the final step in the design. Using masking is a great way to isolate certain areas and prevent the wrinkles from going into areas you don't want them in. When you're adding these high-level details, think about the surface that you're trying to sculpt. Is it soft and fleshy, like around the eyes where the skin needs a lot of movement for the character to be able to blink? Or is it more stiff, like the armour plates, so instead of bending and developing wrinkles over time, it's more likely to have been damaged in battle and develop cuts and scratches? As you add detail, try and think about the overall appeal of your character. So just like when you create an entire scene, you want the camera to focus on certain areas by using composition, lighting and colour, you want to achieve the same idea with the detail on your character. So you don't want the entire character to have extreme detail covering every single part of his body. That makes every aspect of your character attract attention and just results in visual noise. Leaving some areas less detailed helps bring focus to other areas. So for our Gremlin here, there's a lot of detail in his face and around his eyes, but his chest, for example, is left largely smooth except for some light scaling. We want people to be looking at his face. That's the scariest part of the character and where he'll show the most expression. His chest, on the other hand, is not nearly as important. So add lots of detail to his face to help draw the audience's attention there. I add some wear and tear to the shoulder armour by scratching up the surface. Since the armour plates wouldn't bend much, they'll instead develop cracks and scratches. Likewise, I add scratches to the plates on the legs. I also start adding some scales to help blend the plates into the rest of the skin. Now you could use an alpha for these details, but I wanted the scales to follow the shapes of the toes, so I choose to do this part manually. After giving the leg armour and scales a similar treatment, I add some little ridges. These armour plates are bigger than those around the rest of the body, and I really wanted to add something to help break up these larger flat surfaces. The skin folds around the elbows and knees are quite complicated, so rather than trying to sculpt these wrinkles by hand, I choose to use an alpha here to speed up the process. As always, I still come in and manually add some variation to my alpha details. Don't forget, while sculpting, you can hide parts of your mesh to get to those hard to reach areas. This has the added benefit of speeding up your scene slightly too. Just be a little bit careful because it is possible to say hide one arm and not the other, which means that then you can sculpt on one arm and not the other, which can break your symmetry. Detailing the hands is a lot of fun. Since we're unlikely to see these hands in extreme close-up, I'm able to quickly just throw on a couple of alphas without the need to go over everything again by hand. Since we manually sculpted the big wrinkles on the finger joints earlier, now we can add these fine details over the top quickly with these alphas. I wasn't completely happy with the direction of the neck wrinkles I made earlier, so I smooth out some of this excess detail and lay down some base detail with some alphas. I can then use this base as a guideline to manually add some of the bigger folds. Now, because I know people are going to ask, let's talk about my computer specs. Being able to get 52 million or more polygons into your scene doesn't happen by accident, and there's a good chance your personal computer won't be able to go quite that high. I've spoken to a few other Blender users on the forums, and there are some people that are struggling to push past 1 million polys. I do 3D animation professionally, and I use my computer every day. It's my source of income, so I've sunk quite a lot of money into a custom build. This computer cost me around about $5,000 in Australian currency, which is roughly about 3,500 US. So I'm running an Intel i9 processor with a GeForce RTX 2080 Ti graphics card and 32GB of RAM. This computer is quite a powerhouse, so if you're working on a laptop or something with less power, don't expect to get this kind of poly count just yet. That said, Pablo is officially working on a major overhaul to the sculpting mode, which looks like it could double or even triple the speed that you can get and the poly counts you can achieve. The ear is a nice, easy area to detail. I choose a scratchy looking alpha and I change my settings to use the airbrush method. If you increase the rate setting, you can add a slight delay between your stroke, and then adding some random angle will automatically rotate your brush. With the right settings, you can just lightly brush over the area and get this nice cross-hatch pattern in a few seconds. Now we're getting down to some of the really fun stuff. Because we've done a good job of building up the mid-frequency details by hand, we can now start slapping down these alphas and add a stack of detail really quickly. Now this only works because we put in the effort earlier with our larger shapes. Just adding alphas without these larger shapes doesn't look nearly as good. The large shapes we sculpted by hand add form, and the small details that we're adding with alphas add texture. So texture without the form just looks like visual noise, and forms without texture can look simplified and stylized. But when we combine them, we can end up with something that's extremely realistic and detailed. Here I add a bunch of scaly details to the chest. Now, later on I feel like I've added a little too much detail here, so most of this is going to get removed. I'm now up to the point of adding skin details like scales and paws. These details are very small and very detailed, so there's almost no way to place them by hand. Or at least there's no way to place them quickly by hand. I want these scale details to be fairly subtle. As we've discussed before, you don't want your entire model to have these uber high details everywhere, otherwise you just end up with visual noise. We've already gone to so much trouble getting in some of these beautiful fine details on places like the face, we really want those details to stand out. So although it can be tempting to go nuts with alphas, because let's face it, it's really fun to be able to add stacks of detail really quickly, try and have a little restraint. I use a number of different alphas in this sculpt, most of which are free, although there are a couple in there that I've paid for. I'll make sure that there's links in the description to as many as I can, but I have collected a few of these over a number of years and I can't always remember exactly where I got everything. There's a few joints where I want to add some crease wrinkles, such as the wrists and the inner elbow. These are areas that have a lot of movement in them, and although they're not as obvious as, say, the deep wrinkles on the face, it's still important to get them in there. I add a scattering of little dots all over his body as skin defects, maybe little warts or something. For at least some of this sort of detail, it's a good idea to turn mirroring off. Having some of these details be in exactly the same spot on both sides of his body can look really unnatural. It's unlikely somebody's going to have warts on exactly the same place on both arms. So some symmetry is okay, it's unlikely to be noticed, and it'll allow you to work faster, but the closer you get to the middle of your character, the more obvious it will become. With all the armour and wrinkles in place, I can start adding the tiny alpha scales to the legs. This is basically the same process as adding the details to the arms. Use these little details to break up the surface, but don't make them in your face and obvious. Let the big details like the armour plates attract the attention. As I did with the fingers, I used some alphas to add wrinkles to the toe joints. Again, these are parts of the Gremlin that would bend a lot and therefore develop wrinkles over time. These are necessary details to get in, but they aren't the main focus of my sculpt, so I'm happy to use alphas for these details rather than sculpting each wrinkle by hand. Here you'll notice a little defect in the toe I didn't notice when we did the reprojection. This is very easy to fix and it's the same process as we used earlier. Drop down to a lower subdivision level and smooth out the dint, then jump up to another level and smooth again. Keep doing this until you're back at your highest subdivision level. Now with this many polygons, it may take a little while to jump up and down your subdivision levels. Now it's back to the face to give some extra skin detail. As with the other parts of the body, we've gone to quite a bit of effort to get all these large details in place. The last thing that we want to do now is add so much alpha detail that we distort all of that. So make your skin details subtle and let the large details speak for themselves. Don't forget to add a bit of skin detail to every part of your model. The top of the head here would be quite easy to forget about. The armour plates on his legs kind of push on the skin and fat on his tummy. To allow him to bend properly, the skin here must move quite a bit. That will develop wrinkles. So kind of like the joints on the fingers, we want some large scale wrinkles where the skin deforms the same way most of the time, but then lots of little wrinkles for the subtle differences in his movement. At some point, I actually feel like I have too much detail on the chest. As I said earlier, you want areas of your model where the eyes can kind of rest. Too much detail can be overwhelming, and I feel that the chest, which isn't an overly important part of the model, is attracting too much attention. So I smooth out all of this excess detail, and after a little bit of reshaping, just add a light speckling of scales to avoid over-detailing it. The armour on the tail looks good, but it too needs some skin detail just to break up these large flat areas. So with the airbrush as my stroke method again, I choose a grungy kind of alpha and lightly brush over all of these surfaces. This will be particularly important later on when we want to break up our roughness map and prevent this area from getting too reflective. I had a bit of trouble getting the scale alpha to apply to the toes. I think my base mesh just didn't quite have enough polygons in this area, and even with this high resolution, the alphas start to come out a little bit blurry. So I subdivide my multi-res one last time, bringing my final polygon count to just over 100 million. Now at this point, even my custom built computer, which I use professionally for jobs, starts to lag. Don't be fooled by this sped up video, this was very painful to work through. At present, Blender can only just manage this higher poly count, and I wouldn't recommend going this high. That said, amazingly Blender doesn't crash, and I managed to get these incredibly high details in. But it would definitely have been better to have more detail in my retopology, which would have added more polygons in this area, but it means I wouldn't have had to subdivide the entire mesh in the process. So I probably would have ended up with around maybe 60 to 70 million polys, which my computer probably could have handled. The veins on his arm wrap up the last of the body sculpting, but we're not quite done yet. His extra body parts, such as his claws, teeth and tongue, still need a bit of sculpting to work them up to the same level of detail. I really don't want to sculpt each claw individually, so I delete most of them and just work on one, which I can then duplicate and reshape as needed. The nice thing about this claw is once it's detailed, I can pretty much just duplicate it for all the hands, feet, the chin and even the teeth. I have several references for different types of claws. This style had a particular shape to it, kind of a diamond shape that tapers towards the end, so I spent a bit of time reshaping this claw to match. After that, adding details is a combination of cutting in little lines with the crease brush or using alphas. For claws that are identical, such as the claws on the hands, I instance the claws by using Alt-D, so if I make any changes to one claw, all of the other claws on the hand will be updated. For the claws that I want to be different, such as the slightly larger, curvier claws on the feet, I'll duplicate them with Ctrl-D. This then allows me to go to the lowest level of subdivision on my multi-res modifier and reshape them slightly. Once you go back up to the highest level of detail, it reprojects all the tiny little scratches onto the new shape. This allows me to keep those extreme details while having a slightly different shape. I do the same with the chin and even with the teeth. I'm fairly sure this reprojection is an update in Blender 2.9, although this could be done in an earlier version, I don't think it worked quite as well as it does now. Don't forget to make sure that your claws sit into your model nicely. For the claws on the chin, I need to resculpt this area a little, just to give the claws a little pocket to sit into. Although we won't see much of it, the tongue is really under-detailed compared to the rest of the sculpt. Since we won't be able to see that much of it, I do a relatively quick detailed sculpt, mostly using alphas to give it some texture. Finally, I replace the teeth with the new high detailed versions and make sure they're placed correctly. I also quickly replace the spikes on the back of the heel too. And then, after 30 hours or so of work, the sculpt is finally done, which means it's now time for a dramatic reveal.